All right, I'll start off with an easy one. And this is a general question to the panel. I guess lots of you have been in the industry for some time now. I'm very new to this, but I'd like to ask, what makes you the most optimistic compared to where you were 10 years ago in terms of delivering a low embodied carbon future for aluminium here in Australia?
I mean, 10 years ago, we were still having conversations if climate change was a thing. So I think, and if we moved to renewable energy and it hailed on the solar panels, what would happen? So I think actually, the last decade has just been an incredible, pace of change for, the realization that, hey, this is actually a thing, we can all measure it. We're all going to be impacted in our lifetimes. I think this is not just, our children's children conversation, this is us. And so I think actually just that whole, collective awakening to the reality of this situation, the urgency of this situation, is what gives me, the most optimism. But I think particularly for embodied emissions, that conceptualization around, circularity, that we need to, really look at what goes into the making things, that it's not about, it's not all about electricity, and that we have a whole professional stream of people who can provide that advice and who can provide that measurement in an accurate and reliable way so that we can use it to make decisions. I hope I just didn't steal your answer there, but yeah.
I think from our perspective, Jeff, it's the corporate sector's having a real role to play here, and we're seeing through ESG reporting, and if you look at any of the annual reports in the ASX listed or corporate businesses, their sustainability reports are almost outweighing their corporate financial reports. And to that end, I think that wave of commentary that I spoke about, where we're getting inquiries from every department within businesses about the aluminium, where it's coming from, I think it's the weight of the people that's really giving us or buoying us here, or making us optimistic that the change is coming.
I think if we sat here and talked about all the things that make me optimistic, we'd be here for a very long time. So what I'll summarize saying that it's transitioning the conversation. I've seen it's become no longer just like a nice to have, but a need to have. And one thing that I've seen, at least internally in Lendlease, is setting those targets has created a huge amount of momentum and change within our company internally. And seeing all the targets that are being set around the industry, I'm hoping that there's similar conversations going on with our competitors. And I guess another thing is it's becoming a license to operate. Companies are simply just not allowed to operate anymore unless they're doing something about their environmental footprint. And I think that's a really positive change in society that I'd like to see more of.
Seb, oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I echo that as well. And investors, what I'm seeing, are starting to value upfront carbon. And as we start to value it and ask for, what are people's scope 3 downstream emissions, that's when we see this kind of filtering into the supply chain. And what we're kind of interested in as well is like really enhancing the transfer of knowledge between parties in relation to the environmental and social aspects. And then, I guess across time, I want to actually start seeing that move to a much more data-driven assurance, because at the moment, it's all still done on a transactional, and as Kari was saying, that those supply chains are very, very difficult to mobilise. And so, the strengthening of seeing people use EPDs is definitely the way to go, and investors really seeking and pushing the envelope with asking for ambitious, LCA targets of 50%, Thanks, Jeff.
Sure. I'll come to you in a second, Margie. I just want to touch on something else, Seb, that we've talked a lot about in our working group related to this issue of, kind of supply chain custody and understanding where our stuff comes from. I think a lot of us, whether it's the clothes we wear or the buildings we build, we don't really have an appreciation for where all this stuff comes from and what the environmental and particularly social impact of these things are. Can you touch on a little bit more about the kind of how the CEFC also kind of investigates or looks into issues of modern slavery in relation to the investments that you make?
So yeah, as a requirement, we require all of our counterparties to provide statements. But probably what we're seeing as a consequence is both the investors are looking at opportunities to onshore, governments looking at onshoring opportunities, and as well bringing manufacturing here. Thinking about the example here today. It's like, why can't we be processing that onshore? It makes complete sense. And as well, it's due to the fact that we've got this transparency challenge, and this last minute to delivery. It's beginning to disrupt our kind of construction sector, which we're seeing today, where we're seeing, polarization and, 20%, 30% inflation. And so, governments are looking to review, modern slavery with the new incoming government. And, I see a lot of opportunities that are arising because of this decade of Scope 3 decarbonisation. Back to you.
Mike, would you like to mic? Yeah. Okay.
Margie Johnson, Australian Aluminium Council. Blaise, thank you for sharing some of the insights into the challenges of unlocking, getting what comes out of a building or whatever back into a smelter. And that's certainly something we're all aware of. You mentioned, I think it was that's the word, Alumisource. Is that available here in Australia? And what would be the challenges to bringing something like that? We have got 4 smelters here in Australia to be able to close that loop. What are some of the challenges and also, I guess, policy changes we might need to be able to do that? Not putting you on the spot.
So not yet. So Alumisource is currently only in our North American business. And really that's around scale. So 2 things is we have the scale of the input material to be able to control it kind of all the way through, the intake, the processing, and we have scale at the destination end. We have the demand for recycled content in that market. So I think that's very much one. I think around policy settings, and there's all sorts of kind of interesting settings around, trade of scrap, etc. I think certainly, it's important also to make a distinction between unprocessed scrap and processed scrap. Processed scrap is a commodity. Unprocessed scrap is waste. Like unprocessed scrap is a car. It's a fridge. And we need more controls around that because, it's important that we don't, then send that product offshore where that waste component is just, burned on an open fire or whatever, just to get the valuable metal out. I think the more important thing for policy settings, Margie, is, the circular economy is a circle and all parts of the circle kind of have to move together. That's the fun thing about it. So, we need those settings that encourage, onshore manufacturing and remanufacturing, that encourage the investment into all those kind of challenges and pain points all the way along the circle. So, there's not a magic bullet answer for this one.
Add something to that. I think as an architect or a designer, there's lots of talk about way buildings are procured or built. I know that particularly in Europe, there's lots of kind of conversations around how buildings will become services. So you may own them, but you may not own the lights. You may not own the facade. So the people that build the facade own the facade and they monitor it for you. And when they do, then they obviously have the benefit of taking it away at the end of its life and then using it as, obviously as a resource. So I think that'd be a big change in the way that we do stuff. Certainly the idea that we start to kind of understand all the materials that go into their building, that they have ID, that they're scannable, traceable, we know what alloys they are, but is coming. And also designing for disassembly as architects and engineers, making sure that the things we design can be easily kind of pulled apart and not kind of have all the other residue on them that probably mucks it all up.
It's also really important to realize that metal is a really long-lived commodity, right? And you put something in a building and it's in that building for the entire lifespan of the building, which is decades, right? Might even be 100 years if you build a beautiful building and you do it right. Those the reality is that, we need to start on that design phase as soon as possible so that it enters the waste stream in a way that's, appropriately clean and safe as soon as possible. Because even if you think about a car, I think the average age of a car on the road in Australia is 10.5 years old. So if we buy an electric vehicle today, 5% of all new vehicle sales are EVs that have more aluminium. The reality is that only makes up 5% of the waste stream in 10 years. So it's really important to kind of make those right decisions up front, which is what you emphasized as well.
So one of the fun questions around circular economy is that the first step in the process is actually to avoid the purchase or use of products to start off with. And it's always a fun one because it usually means, how do we use less of this? And wouldn't it be wonderful if we can get the demand for all these materials back down to a level where we could possibly survive off 100% recycled aluminium in the stream and not need to produce any virgin aluminium to start off with. So I'm going to ask all of you, of what things do you think you can do better around reducing demand for aluminium?
I'll take the mic first so I can have a chance to not think of something fourth in line. Look, for us, as architects, one of the biggest things that we're really focusing on now is trying to reuse as much of a building as we can. I always talk about flexibility for buildings, and all the buildings we design to be flexible, but I'd say at the moment, the majority of cases is they'll live for 30, 50 years if you're lucky, and then they're going to get torn down. And I just think that mindset has to shift. I think there's some interesting things happening to incentivize developers and landowners to keep their buildings alive. So giving them planning incentive. If you keep a building, then we'll look at giving you more floor area than you would otherwise get if you were to tear it down. And so I think things like that, we're working on a few projects already where that is starting to happen, and councils are the sophisticated councils are really getting behind that and saying, look, that was built 20 years ago. Like, why are you tearing it down? Sure, you're going to take it down. I'm not going to say who it is, but I think that is going to be a big change for us, is really starting to look at what we can keep and maybe what needs to be demolished.
You want to answer that one?
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, echoing the statements of reusing what's already there is the first in that hierarchy, right? So like there's tons of things that you can do. And there's things that are more influential and less influential. And while all are important, it's best to focus on those things that are the most influential. So reusing buildings and what you have there is important. We had a project, One Triton Square in the UK, Lendlease in the UK, and they actually took down the entire facade, refurbished it, put it back up again, and made it more operationally energy efficient, but kept all of the aluminum and the emissions intensive stuff, which is a really cool case study and something we're looking to replicate more. And then, as I said, early on in design, there's some really major decisions that are made around form factor and wall to floor to ceiling heights. I'm not a ratio. Yeah, I'm not a facade designer. I'm just an LCA. I just count the carbons. But like these are things that I've been told that are really influential to the amount of aluminum that you need. And a lot of things that are done from a value engineering perspective also tend to save money as well, and how much that costs. So why not bring all these subject matter experts together, kill two birds with one stone, and find just better ways of getting the same performance out of less materials for the interest of everyone?
Interesting question for a company that makes its money out of extruding aluminium. One thing we do though, is we've gone to a level of circularity by design by circularity. So the same aluminium sections in our proprietary window and door systems can be used across multiple products. So if you take that to a fabricator's premises where they're cutting up a 6.5 meter piece of aluminium to put into a product, that same shape can be used in, be it an awning window or a sliding door or a sliding window. So our role to play there is more does more, or less does more. Less does more. That's the only way. Otherwise, we sell aluminium.
And look, if we could get to a point where all the aluminium was 100% circular, I'd be delighted. So I think, really we've kind of heard, from my part, I think what makes that is about, how do we design to keep things in use for as long as possible? How do we design them in a way, where we can make the most efficiency, in the process, where they're less contaminated in the stream, and how can we design them so that they are less materials intensive, and you mentioned that was, I thought, a really fascinating case study. Steel is probably the other, commodity where they're really having the most thought around, how can we actually look at the properties of steel and the way that it's deployed and what it's deployed with, so that we actually can get the same, building performance, generally it's in the built environment with less metal. And, I think that is going to be a really important part of how decarbonisation sector, if that is achieved. It's not all through hydrogen, it's certainly not all through scrap. A lot of it is just about how do we actually use less.
Okay, I think we're probably out of time, but if you do have more time, please stay with us for some drinks and a chat. If you want to talk more about aluminium, I've got all night. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.